David, appreciate you taking some time with us this morning. You talked to a lot of Razorback connections, some who played, some who coached, and some who covered, like Clay, who's with me now. But what do you think of all the things you learned talking with different sources? What kind of stood out that you learned about this Razorback football program, man?
I mean, I was pretty familiar with it, but I think the biggest thing is just I don't think I realized how aggressively they were going to be boxed out of the Big 12. And you know, you read it in the piece from the Broyles audio from 15 years ago. There's not any couching that. They were not going to get in the Big 12. And so it wasn't really picking between, ride out the Southwest Conference and see about the Big 12 or going to the SEC. It was sort of like, hey, we're going to get thrown out in the wilderness or going into the SEC. And I kind of wrote in the piece that, it's a move that obviously has resulted in the program not being as successful as it once was. But who knows what that looks like if they don't do it. I think that it certainly could be worse, and not only worse, one that has major financial ramifications for the university. So I think, Frank Broyles talking about that decision and sort of the way the program was kind of boxed in 30 years ago, I didn't realize that.
I think, now I could be wrong, this might have been a year. I specifically remember that piece of audio that you're talking about, you referenced. So Clay was doing Bo's show back in the day, and I think I was interning at that point. It might have been a year or two prior to me coming there, but him telling Bo we would not have been invited to the Big 12, talking about Frank Broyles and just kind of the financial ramifications that you're talking about. While the football team hasn't been as successful, David, you can't say the same about the other sports. Arkansas led the league last year in SEC championships, so that's where a lot of Arkansas fans, while football hasn't been successful, they've definitely succeeded in a lot of other sports. And when you look at Arkansas, not just the football program, but as a whole, what dynamic do you think they've added to the Southeastern Conference?
I think the biggest thing is just another place that fits culturally, because you look around the SEC and, especially before the recent, additions, but you look around the SEC and you see a lot of places that, that program that is an SEC member, they're the most important thing in that state. And certainly Arkansas fits into that, and you have an entire state that obviously cares about the Razorbacks, and you can see that anywhere you go in the state. So I think that's the biggest thing is, the cultural fit. You never have those conversations about Arkansas in the SEC. Maybe I missed those back in the 90s, but Arkansas feels like very much a cultural fit. And, you look at some of the new additions, obviously Texas jumps out there, Oklahoma, Missouri, not as much. And so I think that's the biggest thing is that, especially as the league expands, in a lot of ways, it feels like Arkansas has always been in the SEC.
You talk about culture, David. We're talking with David Ubben of The Athletic about his recent piece. My buddy Josh Pate over at 24/7 Sports keeps talking about culture with Sam Pittman and its Arkansas football program. For the third consecutive season, they find themselves with the toughest schedule in college football. Vegas has them at about 6.5 wins right now. Based on what you know about the SEC and this daunting schedule that awaits, David, what should Arkansas fans' expectations be with Sam Pittman and this team in year 3?
Well, it's tough because college football obviously is a results business, but I think it's hard, or I would encourage a lot of fans in general, not just Arkansas fans, but anyone to borrow a phrase from a coach who's won a couple games, trust the process and keep looking at closer than what the final score is on Saturday. I think ultimately, is the program getting better? Are the players getting better? Are these games competitive? The gap between winning 10 games in a season and 6 to 7 games is real thin, and that works both ways. And so that's, I think what I would say is the expectations, people can put a number on it, whatever you want. Obviously they have a really tough schedule, both in non-conference and, of course, as they do every year in conference. But I think ultimately you have to look at what is the team actually doing? How are they stacking up when they have to play Alabama? When they have to play, LSU? What does that look like when they have to play teams that have more talent? Can they compete? And, under Sam Pittman, the answer to that question has been a pretty resounding yes more often than it's been no. And I think that, you want to win games and you want to do these things. You want to put yourself in the program in a position to win as many games, as many years as possible, not, let's win 8 games next year or whatever people want to talk about. So that's where I would sort of focus rather than putting a number on it and say, hey, if we win fewer than 8 games this year is a failure. If we have a losing season, it's a failure. I think you have to look closer because this is still a program that is building, still a program that's trying to set a foundation. And I think when you're in that spot, it's a little different than if you're Michigan and you're saying, hey, if we don't beat Ohio State, this season's a failure, and having your entire season come down to that game, it's a little different in year 5 or 6 where the program's a little bit more built up.
David, you also referenced in your piece about only 6 teams in this league that have won an SEC championship, and Clay and I were kind of kicking around last segment about the idea of Arkansas baseball or Arkansas basketball winning a national championship. Prior to that, Musselman's, this will be his 4th season. Dave Van Horn has been here since, I think, 2003, and maybe the idea that Eric wins one before Dave. But for Arkansas football, I just don't feel like that is talked about as much, that they can win a national championship. And with the schools, Tennessee, Florida, LSU, Alabama, Auburn, and Georgia are the only ones that have won it. How does Arkansas get into that level, that mode? They've been in 06, they've been in 02, and they've been in, I guess, where's the other one? They went in 95. But how do they overcome that hurdle that only 6 other teams have been able to in this league?
I mean, ABC, always be Cruton, right? It has to be there. I'm a big believer in blue chip ratio. Now, I think it will be interesting to see if an expanded playoff affects that and what that means. Because if you talk about an expanded playoff, if it ends up being 12 teams, getting there, once a recruiting cycle or so, it seems very, very realistic to me for Arkansas. And that is not going to be a small thing. I think that's, for programs like, Arkansas, programs like, a Penn State, or a place that is a really good program, but is very hard to get over the top and get into the playoff as is. I think that's a big reason why the extended playoff can be a really big thing. So, ultimately, it's just very difficult for Arkansas to recruit at the level that it needs to really compete for a national championship. You look at Arkansas's roster, you look at 10 other rosters in the SEC, and you compare it to what Alabama and what Georgia have, and the way that they sort of set the standard in the sport. You look at Ohio State, to a lesser degree Clemson somewhat, but you even look at what A&M is doing now. It's just different. A&M, 8 5-stars in one class. That's impossible. I'd be curious to know how long it's been since Arkansas signed 8 5-stars total. It's probably been, 20, maybe ever, So that is a real thing that you've got to deal with, and it's just very difficult to recruit the kind of classes that you need in Arkansas to really go toe-to-toe and compete for national titles.
David, you used to cover the Tennessee beat, and for Arkansas fans, football, basketball, and baseball are all a big deal here, especially the way that the basketball program's been chugging along, the baseball program for all these years, not just under Dave, but under Norm DeBryan, and now the football program, Sam Pittman, seems like it's bringing that back. When you were at Tennessee, I know it was probably a little different than it is now, the way Vitello's got that baseball team and Barnes has that basketball team, but when you look at not just the landscape in Knoxville, but other SEC programs, how much fan differentiation, or how much do fans care about the other sports outside of just football, maybe just different than Lexington and then in Fayetteville compared to the other sports?
It's a tough balance, because I think a lot of places feel the same way. And I would venture to say Arkansas might feel similar, that people get excited about these things, baseball, basketball. They care. They're going to show up. They're going to watch the games. They're going to talk about it. If you could trade a decade of that success in all those sports for one football national championship, I think almost everyone in the SEC would do it. And so it's sort of a tough thing. It's not that those things don't matter. It's not that people don't care about those things. But it just doesn't, turn the wheel at most SEC places like it does football. What you do in football means the most. For one, there's the financial aspect of it. There's just so much more money in football than any other sport. But again, and you sort of, you read it in the piece, football is the SEC's game. It's just different. And, that is the sport that has defined the league. And for all the success that it's had in all the other sports, which is all that stuff is true, and people do care about it and show up, still a football league.
Hey, David, it's Clay.
I'm going to bring Clay Henry in here. I know you just had a conversation, David, and you got a chance to talk with him and some others as well. Go ahead, Clay.
Hey, David. When you look at what Texas A&M just did in recruiting, how much is that victory over Alabama worth? And what would happen at Arkansas? And you see all of the 4-stars and top-end players that Arkansas is on right now over the next 2 years. What would, winning a game like that do to the recruiting and the elevation, the whole, rise of the program?
I mean, it wouldn't hurt, but, regardless of what Jimbo Fisher wants to say, collectives and money are driving this recruiting cycle. They just are. People can deny it. People can say, no. Money and collectives and name, image, and likeness are driving this recruiting cycle in 2023. So, Arkansas can beat Alabama. Texas can beat Alabama all you want, but you're going to be well-funded. Right now, the amount of money that is out there for 5-star kids and high 4-star kids, I mean, these are 6-figure deals, 7-figure deals. These things are happening. These things are going to influence the future of the recruiting. So what happens on the field matters. Kids don't want to go somewhere that just went 2-10, but you better be well funded. And I think for every school that's trying to recruit, that has to be the number one thing. Collectives, I've been writing about them. We've been talking about them. That is the most important thing in college sports right now. And I think casual fans don't necessarily understand just how important it is yet, but they will. And it is going to be a thing that is, very, very, very integral. And I think it somewhat has flown under the radar because a lot of these contracts have confidentiality clauses in them, and people aren't out here trumpeting exactly what they got. I mean, me and my colleague wrote about the infamous $8 million man from the 5-star recruit who's getting $2 million a year. I mean, that's not far from the going rate for 5-stars. And so, you can do all the things and have the dynamic coach and all the things, but recruiting has changed. It is not what it was literally a year ago. It has changed, and that's the focus moving forward.
Yeah, I think maybe we can slide that around and use exactly what you just said, and a victory over Alabama will encourage your top-end boosters to pony up. And
I think so. Sometimes I wonder if a loss might do that, though. I'm sick of it.
Oh, no, the loss changes coaches.
yeah, that does too, yeah.
When you look at where Arkansas is it close? Is it 3 years, 4 years? And it's like, in how much is related to holding a coaching staff together during this next 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I think continuity is huge. I think the question is sort of an interesting one because when you talk about close, well, the question is sort of close to what? What is the ceiling for Arkansas's program? That's one of the things we tried to hit on in the piece, and I don't know that we know just yet because, obviously, Barry Petrino had it really going there before his situation ended. There's the question of, well, could he sustain that with the way that he was recruiting and with the way that he generally treated people and his penchant for making enemies at different places that he goes. But Sam Pittman, you look at what he's doing, I think certainly, it looks like more sustainable than we've seen at Arkansas in a long time, and he seems like a really good fit. But, getting close to maxing out the potential, I think you're still 2 or 3, 4, recruiting classes away. But what exactly that potential is, I think is certainly up for debate, and it's certainly something that it will be interesting to see as college sports changes and as, we see a lot of upheaval. I mean, the sport has changed more in the last 18 months than it has in the last century. And what does that look like and who can ascend? I mean, it's a little bit like geopolitics. Not to get too, largely, world-centric, but like when there is upheaval, there is room for upward mobility. And who takes advantage of that and who doesn't adjust to the new world? College football, right now on the ground looks very different, but in 5 years, the standings are going to look very different. And who benefits from that, I think right now is being literally decided.
Yeah, so this is a big picture question, because that's what your piece was. It's all big picture. I mean, it is, from, you like to say, from 5,000 feet. I think your piece was from outer space. I mean, it covered it all. But we were writing pieces nationally. I'm not talking about me, but like you, about how Arkansas was free falling through the abyss. Is this a sign, you writing this piece, that they no longer are there but are rising towards, a top 10 position if things fall right in a season?
Maybe. I mean, I think, not to step on my colleague Ari Wasserman's, stage, but it does come down to recruiting. I just think it comes down to talent. Do you have the dudes? And figuring out a way to get them, like you said, your on-field matters. Your how funded are you? That's going to matter. And I think that you just have to stack classes on classes on classes, and that's how you do it. I don't think that, it comes down to one game or, can we catch Alabama on the right day? You gotta stack them up if you were thinking about, hey, we want to be a top 10 program. So it just all comes down to recruiting and figuring out ways to get guys. And Sam Pittman has that magnetism about him. He seems to have a pretty good strategy. But, like I said before, it's a results business. Can you consistently, and if you want to be top 10 in the standings, you better be at least top 15 in recruiting. And that doesn't even guarantee you anything. That just gives you a shot.
Yeah, the place that they've got to change, and, like you say in recruiting, defensive line top talent. And that's what the SEC is. And would you think that's the missing link, or is that too deep into it?
No, I do think the SEC is still a line of scrimmage league. Despite the how much has changed, offensively and schematically throughout the league, and how much more of an offensive league it is. I still think the team that controls the line of scrimmage is the team that wins. I mean, you look at, Alabama's not the greatest example because they do everything well, but if you look at why they have been so sustained for so long, it's because they're really good on the lines. And you look at A&M right now, what they're doing, why do people think that they are going to be well-positioned to grow? I think they've signed like 8 5-star linemen in the last 2 classes, something like that. I mean, that's some special stuff that you have there if you can develop those guys. And so I don't disagree. I think it starts on the line, and if you can get a transcendent quarterback at some point, that's probably as important, if not more important, and quite frankly, a little bit easier because it's one player and not having to sign, 4 really good linemen on both sides of the ball in each class, which just takes a lot more work. But I think you need both of those. I think you need one player that really elevates the program and sort of changes things, and every time he's on the field, you have, the other 80 guys on the sideline saying, we got a shot because this guy's going to have the ball in his hand. That kind of guy just changes things. And then, of course, you got to build on the lines, like I said. So, if you want to talk ascension and the importance in recruiting, I think it starts at those 2 spots.
David Ubben of The Athletic, kind enough to give us some time this morning. If you haven't read his piece, it's awesome. Go check it out at The Athletic. David, appreciate you joining me and Clay, and we'll talk maybe later on during the college football season, man.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it. And Clay, I appreciate your time for this story, man. I really appreciated that.
You wore me out that day.
I'm sure I did.
Oh, hey, David, real quick, I forgot to mention this. You played basketball in boys club with my old high school coach. I wanted to pass that along. AJ Killam. I don't know if you remember
that was like 3rd grade Canes over at the Springdale Youth Center. My guy AJ, yeah, he's a good dude and making well for himself in the coaching world. But man, I think I just aged 30 years by you saying that. That is rough, man.
Well,
that is
David,
rough.
Is that the point where you realized you weren't a basketball player in 3rd grade?
No, I had it going in basketball. I think the point when I realized that I was not a basketball player was going to high school and getting stuck behind an NAIA point guard and being like, wow, he's a lot better than me, and just being like, I'm out. I don't want to spend all this time working to play 6 minutes a game.
Oh, man. All right, Dave. Well, good catching up, man. Sorry I aged you a little bit, but it's good to have you on this morning.
I appreciate it. We all need a little humbling sometimes. I appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
You got it. David Ubben of The
Line
Athletic.
is your number one source for all your betting needs, sports info, and odds. Find all the latest sports developments, including this week's odds for the Masters Championship and the start of Major League Baseball season. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sporting wagering needs, including live betting and your favorite Vegas casino and poker games. It's super easy to get started, so join today. Learn why everyone is saying BetOnline is the fastest and easiest way to wager on popular sports and games. BetOnline, where the game starts.